So here we are in October of 1950 with Tonkin, the First Indochina War by Kanger, produced by Legion Wargames. So this is scenario 1, and I had done a playthrough of the intro scenario, which oddly is scenario 6, but I guess timeline wise it's October to November of 52. So here we are in 50. I'm probably going to scrap the intro scenario I did because I was doing the operations wrong. So the game kind of ground to a halt pretty quickly. This is the scenario. All the white you see are dug in French troops. They are blue and red. These are the political objectives. Red is the Viet Minh. So this is the First Indochina War and the opening of the major hostilities. There was some little skirmishes before this, but this is kind of when I guess the war is considered to have started. So the game is fairly straightforward. It has some nice subtleties to it. It's played in 6 phases. I'll go in here. There's a reinforcement phase, Viet Minh movement phase, the French movement phase, attrition, which is when units that were out of supply the previous turn take a step loss unless they are now in supply. So your units don't suffer right away. Next is an operation phase, which is the meat of the game, and then a supply check. So during each operation phase, what happens is there are supply dumps in the game, and I need to mark where mine are. I always lose them, but basically each player has supply dumps. Each player will start the operations phase with 10 operation points, right there, and then the Viet Minh player first decides whether they want to play a supply dump to increase the number or the options of their operations, and then the French do the same. However, if neither player spends the supply dump, and this is what they look like here, then there's no operation phase at all, which is very interesting. If I remember correctly from the rules, they pretty much say that the French do better by making the game go faster. So it's really, the onus is on the Viet Minh to spend those supply dumps to actually make there be an operations phase. And I can definitely see that. So the things you can do during the operations phase is movement, and pretty typical stuff here. It's harder for the French to get around. Here you can see the terrain chart. So moving through rough and forest terrain, the Viet Minh pay 2 and 3, and the French pay 4 or 3 and 4, which is pretty interesting. And that's just ground troops, which are the white and black movement numbers. The 14 is mechanized. During movement, you can also overrun for a movement of 2. So you have to get here and then go in, and we'll review how overrun works, I'm sure, later. It seemed to happen a lot in my last one. If you spend a supply dump, you can, units within the range of the supply dump, so say we're spending here, within 3 of a supply dump, those units can attack a unit, or a hex, I guess. During the operations movement, only 1 hex would move, and that's what I screwed up. I was spending an operation point to moving everyone on the board of that side, and then continuing. The game locked up pretty quickly. There was 2.5 areas of operation. So with this, the game's going to go it'll go faster, but it will spread out what's happening at the same time, which I think will make for a much more interesting game than what I was running into. You can entrench, and to entrench you have to spend a supply dump, and then within the range of that supply dump, you can put 3 trench markers down. You can barrage, much like the attack. Again, this one you need to have a spending supply dump to do it. And then, let's see, where do we have? There are artillery somewhere on the board here, and they can barrage a single hex, but they have to be within, I think it's 3 of the spending supply dump. And I guess the last thing you can do is destroy roads, or repair roads, which in the last one, in the intro scenario, basically the area of operations is here to about here, like that. So there's not much need to destroy roads, because most of the movement took place right in here. But here you can see the board is much more sparsely populated, and so those roads would probably be more important. One interesting thing during either movement is if you don't enter an enemy zone of control, you get double movement points, which is pretty huge, especially for the Viet Minh. They generally have better movement points. These Thai units have 19, and some of these mechanized units that the French have are at 14. But in general, I would say that the Viet Minh have greater mobility, so then if they're not entering a zone of control, they can scoot around pretty quickly. And then the last thing we talked about is supply. You just have to be within range of a supply center or a supply dump. It doesn't have to be, well, it can't be the spending one, because by that time that supply dump is going to be spent. So that's pretty much an overview of how the game works. It's a tug of rope victory point system. The French are gaining victory points for doing things, or I think I might have that backwards. Yeah, I think the Viet Minh are gaining victory points. Yeah, the Viet Minh are gaining victory points and the French are taking them away. So things that gain victory points, taking over political objectives, which are here. I haven't laid those out yet. The Viet Minh are also just trying to get communities on their side. So communities are these black dots. If they're within the hex or in the zone of control of a Viet Minh unit and aren't occupied by the French, then it's controlled by the Viet Minh. Controlled, it's more friendly, I guess is the term. And oddly enough, there are just enough markers of each to tell whether the victory point conditions have been gained for that. They need 10 delta units, or delta communities, which is this yellow area. They need 10 of those to get 10 victory points, or 20 in the highlands. Much more densely or sparsely populated. So it seems like that's going to be harder, but maybe not as the game goes on. As you can see, the Viet Minh are mostly, or the French are mostly concentrated over here. So if these 1-9 units, I'll call them TD units, that'll be easier for me to pronounce. If they can kind of spread out and take over some of these smaller communities out here, then maybe that 20 will be easier to get. Oh, no. Yeah. The French are gaining victory points, the Viet Minh are taking them away. That's what I thought. So, yeah, 10 victory points are deducted if the Viet Minh has 10. The French gain by basically destroying Viet Minh steps. Yeah, so units back and forth do victory points, and then political objectives. So even from my first play, it a pretty interesting game, even with me screwing up that one major rule. So we will get started and check back in here in a little bit. So I wanted to quickly take a look at combat. This is going to be an overrun. We're still in the French movement phase. The Viet Minh moved and tried a couple overruns that obviously didn't work too well for them, which is what's going on here. So the French are going to do their own overrun here, and overrun takes place during the movement phase, and you basically just have to pay the cost to get in there plus 2 to do the overrun. You want to be sure to do it within 3 hexes of a supply dump, because if you're not, you get a -2 modifier. So let's take a look at it. The disorganization means that morale is half. The Viet Minh cannot ambush, which in this situation is definitely bad for the Viet Minh. What else can't they do? They can't double move, they can't overrun, and movement gets more expensive. And they don't have a zone of control, which in this case doesn't matter terribly much. So I'm going to stick this here just so we remember it. I'm not using the battle board, but maybe I should be. So we'll bring these out here and take a look at them. The -1, that's interesting. I don't know why that's there. I need to check at that. So it's in the scenario like that. It's interesting why they would do that. Maybe just... So the -1 is basically -1 to all stats. But usually they're reserved for 3-step units. 3 or 4-step units like this. You would put a -1 on there. That's its first step loss. And then you flip it for the second step loss. Oh, you know what? No, you flip it and then you put one. I think I did that wrong too. Putting it first is for 4s. Nope. This has 4 steps. This is the stacking. So it would get a -1, then flip, then -1, and then it's gone. So I think I've been doing that incorrectly also. It's nice to play things multiple times. You get to see what you screwed up. So basically we run down this list of modifiers. Terrain is going to be -1 to the die roll. Morale difference. First, okay, let's just go through the whole procedure. You declare the attack. The defender can retreat before combat, but only these guys and the Path Allow can there. And I think they're not out, but the French GCMAs, they're guerrilla. So next what we do is the defender can ambush. Only the Viet Minh can ambush. Basically you try to roll above the morale. If it's successful, that unit loses a step. That can't happen since they're disorganized. So then each side chooses a leading unit. That unit will take any losses. However, a difference in morale is a plus modifier. So it might make sense for the Viet Minh to choose him, and they'll choose them. The attacker chooses first, but that's what was going to happen. And then we roll 2 dice. It's a 6, and we go through the modifiers. So terrain is going to be a -1, so we're at 5. Doesn't apply, doesn't apply, doesn't apply. Defense morale is +1, so we're back at 6. Overrun outside of supply dump range, doesn't apply. French attack in October 52. It's a -1. Oh, that's interesting. I don't think I took those into account. I don't think they would have mattered anywhere. So we are back down to 4. So we're at a 4 die roll. And now we look at strengths. This is 5 plus 4 is 9. And we're at 12, 13. So for the French, they're less than 1 to 1, so that's going to be a 1 to 2. And a 4. So that's not good. One thing with the game is you can't look through the other person's stack. It's a fog of war type thing, and it's very specific at how the stack goes in the rules. So I had it like that. So the French, all they would be able to see is that. So that's going to be an attacker loss times 2. I think the second loss can come from any unit unless there's an RCC or RICM or DNA. No, just, yeah. Yeah, they take the second hit. So here, we'll do that. But before this happens, actually, I do this and then I figure it out and put things back to normal. But first, before that, what we do is check for disorganization. And if the French roll above a 2, they're going to be disorganized. That's a 1, but there's a +1 to them for the terrain that we're in. Right? Yeah, let me double check that. Because it says check the terrain. But it doesn't say, it's a -1 to combat, so I think it would be +1 here, but maybe it's only +1 to the defender.